I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 28 of my series on the JFK assassination. Immediately after the assassination of President Kennedy, a group of Cuban exile students in New Orleans called the DRE, which were the initials for the Spanish name for this organization, issued a press release advertising Lee Harvey Oswald's communist bona fides. Publicizing his communist background, his trip to the Soviet Union, and suggesting that the assassination was a conspiracy that involved the Soviet Union, Communist Cuba, and Lee Harvey Oswald. This was the organization that Oswald had had an interesting encounter with in New Orleans some months prior to the assassination. That after Oswald moved from Dallas to New Orleans, he began publicizing himself as a communist. And one of the things that he did was he went to the business where the head of the DRE was working, a man named Carlos Bringuier, and he introduced himself and he offered his services, interestingly enough, to this organization. He said, look, I'm a Marine, former Marine. I've got my Marine manual. If you need help with training your people, I'm willing to help you out, which is an extremely odd thing for a supposed communist to be doing, to offer to work for a fiercely anti-communist organization. Well, Bringuier put him off, and then the next day, Oswald is out on the streets of New Orleans, back in his anti-communist mode, or his pro-communist mode, by handing out brochures advertising the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Now, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was a national organization. There were very, very many prominent people in this organization. Their aim was essentially to establish peaceful and normal relations with Cuba, including lifting the U.S. embargo. It wasn't like the U.S. Communist Party, which was naturally composed of people that were very committed to communism. In the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, you had people of that philosophy and socialists, but you also had people that just wanted to establish normalized relations with this country and believe that the embargo was wrong. Well, so Oswald wrote the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and said, I want to establish a chapter here in New Orleans. And he was the only member. And then he also wrote the U.S. Communist Party and wanted to do things to organize the Communist Party there in New Orleans, which had the interesting inference that by combining these two organizations, it had a tendency to smear the Fair Play for Cuba Committee as just another communist organization. Now, the reason that's relevant here is because the CIA and the FBI were fiercely committed to the destruction of these two organizations. Remember, this was the Cold War. It was all or nothing. The communists were coming to get us. The Russians were coming. There was a worldwide communist conspiracy based in Moscow that was hell-bent on taking over the United States. Cuba was a communist dagger pointed at America's throat. You've got, remember, the prosecution of the Hollywood aide, Dalton Trumbo, the McCarthy hearings, and so forth. And so the idea was that these two organizations, along with the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, were the spearhead for the worldwide communist conspiracy. And so, basically in a free society, you got a right to advocate whatever you want, not during the Cold War and not under the auspices of the national security establishment. They were hell-bent on destroying these two organizations. And so Oswald's combining of the two organizations had the interesting impact of trying to smear the Fair Play for Cuba Committee with communist affiliation. Well, he's passing out these brochures, and one of the interesting aspects of this is that he stamps the return address on some of the brochures that is the side entrance to an office of a retired FBI agent named Guy Bannister. Now, there were people also that said they saw Oswald going into Bannister's office. Bannister's office is located in the heart of the U.S. intelligence community in New Orleans. And there's indications that he's affiliated with this anti-Castro, uh, anti-communist fervor that was going on during the Cold War. Keep in mind also that Oswald is working at the Riley Coffee Company, which is owned by a fierce right-wing guy that's anti-communist and anti-Castro, which is kind of strange that, a guy of that persuasion, philosophy, would be hiring a supposed communist. In other words, everything is pointing to the fact, again, buttressing the idea that Oswald is not who they say he was in the official version of the accounts here. That he was actually a U.S. intelligence agency agent whose cover was a communist whose purpose was to infiltrate, for example, the Soviet Union, gather information, whatever he could, or infiltrate the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the U.S. Communist Party, and they had infiltrators in these organizations. There's even some indication that they had a false defector program going into the Soviet Union. And so Oswald clearly fits this mold. Now, he's passing out these brochures on the streets of New Orleans, and Bringuier gets wind of this. And so he goes over to where Oswald is on the public streets, and he creates this altercation that has all the earmarks of a fake altercation. That he's saying, "Oh, why are you doing this? I thought you wanted to help me." And Oswald says, "Oh, Carlos, go ahead, hit me. It was like Oswald was under an assignment to create a ruckus here, and to create this communist bona fides for himself. And so the police come, and Bringuier gets off. They just release him, but they arrest Oswald, interestingly enough, not both of them. And so Oswald's taken for disorderly conduct. And while he's in jail, the local jail, he tells the jailer, "Hey, would you please call this FBI agent? I want to talk to him." And so the jailer calls the FBI agent, and lo and behold, the FBI agent comes and pays Oswald a visit. Now, we don't know what they talked about, but it is rather strange that a supposed communist who's in jail for disorderly conduct is going to be summoning an FBI agent who quickly responds and comes to talk to him. Well, in any event, Oswald is convicted of disorderly conduct, so that's more publicity. And then this motivates a radio host in New Orleans to invite Bringuier and Oswald to come in there and debate the issue, this altercation. Well, during this radio show, Bringuier brings up all of Oswald's communist backgrounds, his supposed defection to the Soviet Union, his Marxism, and so forth. So the crescendo is rising about Oswald being a communist. And this is part of what the DRE uses right after the assassination to publicize that Oswald's a genuine communist, and this is a communist conspiracy. Well, soon after that, Oswald goes to Mexico City, and he does the same thing there. He creates this huge ruckus at the Cuban embassy, the Soviet embassy. "I want a visa. I want to go to the Soviet Union. I want to travel through Cuba." And they're like really leery, and they say, "Well, no, we can't do that here. You have to go through Washington, blah, blah, blah." And so you've got all this big ruckus going on in Mexico City. Now, in the 1970s, mid-1970s, the House Select Committee reopens the investigation into President Kennedy's assassination. Too many people had been asking questions. They were leery of the official version. Everything seemed a little too pat here. Communist kills president, low nut, with no motive, doesn't brag about it, denies it, claims he's been set up. All of a sudden, a mafia-like figure silences him, supposedly grieving over this whole thing. People were this made no sense. And so the House Select Committee, responding to this public pressure, reopens the investigation. And there were investigators on the House Select Committee that suspected that this had been a highly sophisticated, highly complex regime change operation. So they start targeting the CIA for investigation. And one of the areas that they wanted to investigate was Mexico City. Because as soon as Oswald's killed, the whole Mexico City side of this thing is shut down. I mean, you almost get the impression that U.S. officials said, "Just leave it alone. Do not go down that road anymore. He was there. He created this ruckus. Let it go." Well, the House Select Committee investigators did not want to let it go because it was very mysterious. To this day, it's shrouded in mystery. The House Select Committee assigns two law students named Dan Hardway and Edwin Lopez uh, to deal with the CIA and investigate this Mexico City operation. Well, the CIA obviously thought that these two guys were just neophytes. They're law students. They're not, not going to know what they're doing and so forth. And so they say, oh, yeah, come on in. We're going to have a sealed room for you. Can't take anything out. National security is at stake here, but you can look at whatever records. We're going to be an open book for you. Well, after a while, the CIA realizes that Hardaway and Lopez know exactly what they're doing. They're not neophytes at all, and they can tell by their requests for record production that they are getting very close to something. And the CIA freaks out over this. So they decide to bring in a liaison to facilitate things. That was their cover story. That, to really make things better for these two guys, we're going to bring in an agent that's going to work with them and help them out. And so they bring an agent out of retirement to do this. And he's supposed to work with them and so forth. But as it turns out, his job was to obstruct them, to stop them, delay them, obfuscate, and so forth, to prevent them from getting these records relating to Mexico City. Now, if we move up to the 1990s, the Assassination Records Review Board, you'll recall the JFK Records Act mandated that the CIA and other federal agencies release all the records. But somebody slipped a provision in the law that, okay, you can release some of them now, but others you can wait 25 years to release them, national security. And so the CIA and the military and other agencies took advantage on some of their records, including the Mexico City records, that those were not going to be released for 25 years because national security is at stake. Well, so that must have felt like an eternity back in the 90s, 25 years now. What are we worrying about? A lot of people going to be dead that are living today. Well, lo and behold, the 25 years comes around last October 2018. And they freak out. I mean, because Trump is saying, I'm going to release these. I mean, the law required that they be released. And even the day before the deadline, Trump says, I'm releasing these. It's going to be real interesting. He sends out a tweet. Well, between that day and the following day, the CIA got to Trump. We don't know how. But all we know is that Trump, the next day, after he already said, I'm going to release him, said, well, I've changed my mind. National security is at stake. We're going to have to keep these records secret for another 3 years. And that includes the Mexico City records, along with tens of thousands of other records, because the CIA says these records will jeopardize national security. In other words, if people see them, more than half a century after the assassination, the United States will fall into the oceans, or maybe even be taken over by the communists as part of the old Cold War worldwide conspiracy based in Moscow to take over the United States. So that's where things stand there. Now, after the Assassination Records Review Board went out of existence, a former Washington Post reporter named Jefferson Morley, who's authored some great books, which I highly recommend. He's got a new book on that is a biography of James Jesus Angleton, who was head of counterintelligence for the CIA. That's called The Ghost. He's got an article on a CIA agent who was in charge of the Mexico City operations. His name was Win Scott. He's authored a book for us called CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. Well, Morley discovers the existence of a CIA agent named George Joanides. Well, it turns out that the DRE, the organization that Oswald had this interesting encounter with and that had promoted Oswald's communist bona fides immediately after the assassination. In fact, they were the first conspiracy theorists. That they were theorizing that Oswald was in a conspiracy with the Soviet Union and Cuba to assassinate President Kennedy. Turns out, as Morley discovers, that the DRE was being funded by the CIA in the months leading up to the assassination, and including the period of the assassination itself, to the tune of a large amount of money. I think it was $50,000 a month, which was a lot of money back then. And Guess who the supervising agent was? It was George Joanides. Now, all of this was kept secret from the Warren Commission. Now, if we move up to the House Select Committee, take a wild guess who that CIA agent was that they called out of existence to serve as the so-called liaison, but really the obstructor to them getting a hold of the records on Mexico City. That would be George Joanides. None of that was disclosed to the House Select Committee. And the House Select Committee was not advised of Joanides's and the CIA's role in the DRE back in November of '63. In other words, Joanides and the CIA were monitoring, supervising, and managing this organization, funding this organization at the time that they issued that press release advertising Lee Harvey Oswald's communist bona fides, which, as I indicated before, dissuaded a lot of leftist groups from questioning the assassination for fear that they would be smeared as a communist for coming to the assistance of Lee Harvey Oswald. Then they also kept it totally secret from the Assassination Records Review Board. None of the Joanides records were released, or certainly not disclosed to the ARRB. And this motivated the chairman of the ARRB, who was, became a federal judge, Judge John Tunham. He was outraged over this when he learned about it. He says, if we had known about this, we would have certainly, done our best to secure all the facts and circumstances surrounding what went on here in '63 with Joanides, the CIA, and the DRE. And then Robert Blakey, who was general counsel for the the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the '70s, he said clearly we were misled here, and he was outraged as well. So you got the CIA keeping all of this thing secret, even though they're involved in this promotion as Oswald, as the supposed communist who's taken out the president. Now, there's another interesting aspect to this. After the Assassination Records Review Board went out of existence, a man named John Newman, whose books I highly recommend, you can just Google John Newman JFK. He's written some great stuff. He's a scholar, researcher, and he's ex-military. He's mastered the arcane language in CIA memos, as their acronyms and codes and so forth. Well, Newman is specialized in figuring out what all these things mean, and he starts studying some of the records that had been released, and he discovers something phenomenal. Turns out that the CIA was monitoring Oswald practically the whole time, watching him very carefully, and especially in the months leading up to the assassination, during his time in New Orleans, during the big Mexico City incident, that the CIA is monitoring him, watching him secretly. They don't tell anybody this. They don't tell the Warren Commission they were doing. They don't tell the House Select Committee. They don't tell the ARRB. And it was just a tight group of people that were doing this, headed by James Jesus Angleton, the head of counterintelligence. Now, why were they doing this? Well, one argument would be, oh, well, he's a communist. I mean, this is what they were doing. They were watching communists, Dalton Trumbo and so forth. But you see, that makes no sense, because they were doing more than just watching communists. They were harassing them. They were prosecuting them. This is a guy that had supposedly defected to the Soviet Union, had given up secrets about the U-2 spy plane, which got shot down shortly after that over Russia. And yet, all they're doing is monitoring him. All they're doing is supervising him. They're not giving him the Edward Snowden treatment. They're not giving him the John Walker Lindh treatment, the Julian Assange treatment. They're just watching him. And then watching him when he comes back to Dallas, they don't report anything. I mean, here's this committed communist supposedly, and here's the city where the president is coming to visit, and the CIA seals its lips. This doesn't make any sense. Especially when it turns out that the presidential parade route is going right near the building of the guy they're supervising and monitoring. They're not going to say one word. Now, one can say, oh, they're just derelict. That stretches things. Nobody can be that derelict when you're monitoring a guy because he's a communist, and you don't even report this to the local FBI that, hey, you need to watch this guy. The president's coming to town. It's a stretch. the more likely explanation is that, you see, by the time New Orleans came around, the regime change operation had gone into play. The war between Kennedy and the national security establishment was just, it was on, and there was no way to reconcile it, because Kennedy had thrown the gauntlet down. This Cold War is a racket, he essentially said. We're going to end it. We're going to stop it. Which, by the way, would have ended the justification for America being a national security state. I mean, back then in '63, people still remembered what it was like to live under a limited government republic. So it's very likely they would say, well, hey, we shifted to a national security state, which is a totalitarian type of structure, because of the Cold War. And now that the Cold War is over, what do we need them for? We need the CIA and the NSA and the massive military industrial complex. So Kennedy was threatening not only a new direction for America, he was threatening the existence of the national security establishment itself, and then secretly negotiating with Castro and Khrushchev. The war was on. And so here, they're monitoring the sky. They're watching him. You would think that, hey, we need to do something here, but they don't do anything. And so why would they be monitoring? Well, if they're setting him up, they have to be watching him to make sure he's not on to them. Because Oswald clearly could have gotten suspicious. Okay, why are they sending me to New Orleans here? Why am I doing all this pro-communist stuff? I've already been to the Soviet Union. I've already come back. Why are we repeating this game here? And then being sent to Mexico City to create this brouhaha. It's very possible that he would say, what's this all about? I mean, going back to the Soviet Union, what am I going to do there? What are they sending me back for? And then he ends up in a building where he sees the presidential parade route coming by that building. It's very possible he could have gotten suspicious. And so when you're framing somebody, you've got to watch them. You've got to make sure that they're not on to you, because if he figures it out that something's up, they might have to abort the mission. So they got to keep close watch of whoever they're going to frame. And that, to me, is the most likely explanation, especially given that they kept it all secret until Newman discovered it. Now, third thing to consider in all this was the Chilean coup in 1973, which is 10 years after the Kennedy assassination. Here you have a democratically elected president, just like here in the United States, who is a socialist and who is doing exactly what Kennedy did. He's reaching out to the Soviets and to the Cubans in a spirit of peace and friendship. He invites Fidel Castro to visit. He has communists in his regime, and the U.S. national security establishment, along with President Nixon, a hardcore right-wing anti-communist conservative, they go ballistic. They say, oh, well, Allende is a threat to our national security, even though he's thousands of miles away. But the fact that he had been elected, that people had elected a socialist, I mean, this showed you that, boy, the communists were coming. The worldwide communist conspiracy was succeeding. So they decided they needed to get rid of Allende. They needed to oust him from power. Democratically elected president, just like Kennedy was. And the mindset was, though, that we've got a problem here. Do we just go and get him ourselves, or do we try to get the national security establishment here? Our counterparts in Chile, because Chile under Allende was a national security state too, a giant military intelligence establishment, very powerful. So they first tried to bribe, the CIA tried to bribe the members of the Chilean legislature to not confirm Allende as president. It had been thrown into the legislature because he had received only a plurality, and under the law, the legislature then decided. And the CIA tried to bribe them into voting against him, but that didn't work. And so they go to the Chilean military and they say, we need you guys to do this. And the head of the Chilean military, the overall commanding general, a man named Rene Schneider, said, no, I'm a soldier. I've taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and the Constitution provides for only two ways to remove a president: impeachment and elections. Not a coup. Not going to happen. Well, the CIA and the military and the national security establishment of the United States was outraged over this. And they're trying to convince Schneider that, look, The national security establishment of any country has the authority, the implicit, implied authority, to remove a threat to national security. And they decide what national security is and what that threat is. And in this case, the president of the country, albeit democratically elected, turned out to be a threat to national security of Chile. And so they were arguing that the Chilean national security establishment had a responsibility to ignore the Constitution and remove the president from office and save the country. Well, Snyder stood fast. So the CIA said, well, we need to remove him from power then. He's an obstacle to this. And so they orchestrated a kidnapping scheme where they smuggle high-powered weapons. They hire local thugs to do the kidnapping. And so the kidnapping attempt takes place on the streets of Santiago. Not surprisingly, Schneider's armed. He's a general. He fights back. He starts shooting during this kidnapping attempt, and they shoot him dead. It's just a classic ambush. And the CIA just acts, oh my God, we're shocked, shocked, shocked. We had no idea that he would get killed. We just wanted to get him kidnapped, which was ridiculous. I mean, killing had to be part of the plan from the very beginning, because once you remove the commanding general from his post through a kidnapping, you can't exactly send him back. I mean, because if you send him back, he becomes the obstacle again. So assassination had to be built into this plan, along with, oh, we're shocked that some underling, inadvertently or decided to take him out without authority. And in any event, it's still a felony murder under the principles of felony murder. The CIA was responsible for this, but nobody ever was brought to justice. Nobody was ever prosecuted, because this is a national security state operation. The federal courts, the Supreme Court, have effectively held that they will not get involved and censor or control or regulate or manage anything the national security establishment does in the name of national security. When the family members of Rene Schneider sued in U.S. federal court for the wrongful death of the murder of their father and their husband, the federal courts threw them out of their ear. So that's the way things operate when you're a national security state. The national security state is everything. It trumps the Constitution, the Supreme Court, the legislature, the president, everything. So that they get rid of Schneider, and then they convince the rest of the military, you have this duty to remove your president, and they go along with that, and that's where Pinochet comes into play. And they had a war against Allende. So you got two branches of government going to war against each other. Now, it's not much different from the war that was taking place between the U.S. national security establishment and Kennedy. It had not turned violent yet until November 22nd, but the war was there. I mean, Kennedy had thrown the gauntlet down at his peace speech and said, I'm moving America away. This is a racket called the Cold War. We can get along. He even proposed a joint moon shot with the Soviets, which would have meant sharing missile technology with them, rocket technology, nuclear test ban treaty, secret negotiations. So here you've got in Chile the situation where Allende is doing the same thing, and this war takes place where the national security establishment is doing its best to assassinate the guy, not with bullets but with missiles. They've got airplanes, jet airplanes from the Air Force, firing missiles in on the National Palace trying to kill Allende. And then they've got him surrounded by infantry and tanks, and Allende's fighting back, but there's no possibility that the executive branch can stand up against the national security branch. And so Allende supposedly commits suicide, which it would not be too surprising, because they rounded up some 50,000 people who had been supporters of Allende and or socialist leaning, and they tortured the heck out of many of them, raped many of the women, did terribly gruesome sexual stuff on the women, and then they killed 3,000 of the people, just murdered them or disappeared them. So it was a brutal war there. And then, of course, we have the dictatorial regime of Pinochet that takes power, and all under the idea that we have saved the country. Okay, it may not be in the Constitution, but the national security state trumps the Constitution because this Constitution, they argued, was not a suicide pact. So if your country is gonna go down by following the Constitution, you don't need to follow the Constitution. That was the mindset. Well, they wanted to keep U.S. involvement in this thing secret. And okay, that could be just general penchant for secrecy by the military and the CIA. But it also could be because it has these very, very fascinating parallels with the Kennedy assassination. The duty of the national security establishment to save a country. And there was two American men who paid the price for this penchant for secrecy. One was Charles Horman and the other was Frank Tarugi. They were guys in their early 30s. Harman was a journalist down there. Tarugi was pro-social. They were both pro-socialists. They worked with the Allende regime. And well, Harman had this weird coincidence of being in the town where the coup started. On the very day it started, it was a town called Viña del Mar, and he's there as a tourist, and he sees all these intelligence types from the United States there in the town, and there's American warships off the waters there, and then all the U.S. officials that are there have passes to get through all the coup checkpoints, and so Harman puts two and two together that the U.S. is part of this thing, and that was the last thing that the CIA and the military wanted to happen. They were hell-bent on keeping everything secret as far as U.S. involvement was concerned. And again, that may be just general penchant for secrecy, but it also could be because of these amazing parallels with the Kennedy assassination. So in any event, they just had Harman and Tarugi murdered. They either directed the Chilean officials to do it, or they authorized them to do it, or requested them to do it. Clearly, Chile would never, Pinochet would have never killed Americans. They're partners. I mean, the U.S. government's partnering with them. They're not going to kill Americans. At worst, they're going to deport them. And sure enough, it was later discovered that there was a State Department secret memo that was held top secret for many years, where they had conducted their own investigation into the Harman and Tarugi murders and determined that U.S. intelligence had played a role in this. And the most likely role is, hey, would you deal with these two guys? We need to get rid of them. And of course, the Chilean officials are going to do whatever the Americans ask of them. But nothing came of that State Department memo. The State Department said, we recommend further investigation, which was a joke because they had to know that nobody's going to follow that recommendation. This is the national security establishment. Nobody's going to investigate them. This is a national security state regime change assassination of two Americans, which shows that they're not above killing Americans. You see, something that they might want to keep secret with respect to what was going on 10 years before. Now, so you've got this penchant for secrecy on this thing. Later, Richard Helms, the CIA director, is asked in Congress whether the U.S. played any role in this, and he denied it under oath. It was a lie. I mean, it was flat out perjury, and it later turned out that they found that it was perjury, and they indicted him for perjury, but they ended up giving him a sweetheart deal because, again, national security establishment, and they let him plead to a misdemeanor, and they fined him, but he comes back to CIA headquarters, and he's got this huge reception of CIA operatives that give him applause and cheer him on, and they pass the hat to raise the funds for the fine. They thought he was heroic for having, kept these secrets by lying to Congress. I mean, it shows you the mindset that was going into this thing. And again, you might say, well, it's just the CIA's penchant for secrecy, except for the fact that of these fascinating parallels with the Kennedy assassination and the Chilean coup some years later. Now, you may look at these three things and say, well, just independently, it's just not that critical. It could be that they just have a penchant for secrecy. But if we put it in an overall context, especially the context of the fraudulent autopsy, things look different. You see, you've got this fraudulent autopsy, which I think clearly by now you should see the overwhelming circumstantial evidence that virtually is conclusive that there was a fraudulent autopsy here. There is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. It is impossible to come up with an innocent explanation. All the explanations are nefarious. And the other thing is that the only way they could have put together the fraudulent autopsy scheme is before the assassination, because it is inconceivable that they could come up with that kind of sophisticated plan in the 30 minutes between the time Kennedy was shot and the time he was declared dead. Remember, the plan is launched at the moment he's declared dead, when presumably Johnson issues the order, get this body out of Parkland, to that team of Secret Service agents at all costs. And that's when they show their guns and there's that violent altercation at Parkland to get the body out. Take it to Parkland where Johnson's waiting for it, where he takes it to Maryland and delivers it in the hands of the military, which conducts his fraudulent autopsy. Well, if the plan was conceived prior to the assassination, that leads to but one conclusion, and that is the plan was part of the assassination. There's no way that they would plan a fraudulent autopsy without having been part of the assassination itself. So that's how we see circumstantial evidence and logic and reasoning working together with this. And when you combine it with what was going on with the DRE advertising Lee Harvey Oswald's communist bona fides, and George Joanidis' role in keeping all that secret, and then monitoring Oswald, not saying anything about it, and then the Chilean coup, when you put all this together, everything looks very incriminating for the U.S. national security establishment.